All right. Hey, everyone. This is the American Prospect Weekly Roundup. We do this every Friday at this time. Thrilled to have for the first time on the Weekly Roundup. By the way, I'm David Dayen, Executive Editor. And for the first time on the Roundup, we have co-founder and editor Bob Kuttner. How you doing, Bob?
Doing well. How about you?
Bob, you're coming to us from New York, where you just had a little shake, rattle, and roll, eh?
Yeah, really. But you know all about that since you're from LA, so you were not
I have
impressed.
I have very little sympathy. I was lightly impressed,
But the weird thing is these alarms keep going off on your cell phone, even though the only message is to stay indoors. So
right. Well, they have this, the emergency system. I guess for earthquakes, they have a few kinks to work out in the greater tri-state area there. But anyway, let's start talking about what we have been working on this week. So on Wednesday, we put out a big piece I did. I went to Brussels earlier this year for a conference that was about antitrust and regulation. And in that time, talked to a lot of people about the trajectory of not, I mean, it was the microcosm was the trajectory of these issues at the EU. The macrocosm, if you will, was the EU itself and how its structure kind of frustrates these issues and plays into how the body has worked over the last 40, 50 years. And you had some great insights. You edited that piece. We're going to take people behind the curtain here. And you had some great insights that was really helpful in writing that piece about sort of how this structure kind of came to be. You know, we have dozens of countries in Europe, and they've overlaid this structure. So you talk about a little bit the history there of Europe, and then I can get into sort of the specifics around these particular issues of regulation.
well, if you look at the United States, one of the insights about the United States is that the way the founders created checks and balances frustrates activist policy. You need these rare periods of supermajorities like
Right.
FDR and LBJ, then you get stuff done. Europe has its own version of this for historical reasons. And back when you had individual sovereign states like Britain or France or Germany, and they sometimes had left of center governments, they could actually govern. They could actually regulate capitalism. Now,
Right.
in
They
effect,
had parliamentary kind of
yeah,
policies where they didn't have these high veto points like the US does, and they could get things done.
right. And the EU has its own version of multiple veto points. I think that's the punchline. And so you've got, 27 members. You've got a Council of Europe, which is the heads of state, which basically has to go along with anything major that the European Commission does. And then you've got this bureaucracy, which is, as your piece indicates so well, which is kind of a law unto itself. And so the paradox that your piece, I think, really lays out beautifully is that ideologically or philosophically, the EU is rather better than we are on some antitrust issues, on some consumer issues, on some tech regulation issues. But the multiple veto points mean that in practice, it's got its own set of problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting here is to look at sort of the trajectory. So you are absolutely right to discuss that. You have this. They call it the trilogue between the European Council, which is the members of the heads of state. You have the European Parliament, which is a rather weak parliamentary body. There are elections coming up in June for this, which it organizes by ideology rather than by country. And then you have the European Commission, which is a bunch of unelected bureaucrats that sit in Brussels. The president, the president of the EU Commission, right now it's Ursula von der Leyen, and she is elected by Parliament. She's not elected popularly. There's sort of a layer of a layer of a layer of a layer of a layer, and this tends to create these silos. It tends to create this sort of endless bureaucracy at the commission. And walking around Brussels, it was kind of interesting, particularly when you get closer to the EU Parliament. The buildings get bigger, the buildings get sleeker. You just notice the pull of industry. You can almost feel it. It's very K Street like in terms of its orientation. And a lot of these bureaucrats go back and forth between consultancies and the EU bureaucracy, and they're very sort of slow and languorous about these particular issues. Part of that because they have to herd all these cats with the council and the parliament, but part of that because it's just sort of institutional in the nature. This idea of the Eurocrat who goes to the same schools and has the same philosophy as the bureaucrats is very apparent. So then, if you look at the trajectory on, let's just take antitrust as an example, and I'll just keep talking while Bob gets something. But if you just take antitrust as the example, a decade ago, you would have definitely said that the EU was ahead of the US. The US had spent 40 years in thrall to this sort of Borkian mindset of consumer welfare, where it didn't challenge a lot of cases. It didn't, really touch corporate power in a major way. And the EU was working on things. Margaret Vestager, who's Danish. She's actually the model for the movie Borgen, or the TV show Borgen. She was the head of the competition directorate, which is known as DG Comp. And she was challenging Google. She was challenging Microsoft and Apple and Facebook and Amazon. And she was built up in the US press in the absence, kind of in the vacuum of anybody who was even giving a minor challenge as sort of the dragon slayer of Silicon Valley. She was definitely built up that way in the US. The problem is it was a bit of an unearned reputation. And none of the cases that were brought at the EU really amounted to anything. They didn't really, first of all, they went through what we also have in the US, which is this judicial roadblock of, endlessly pulling out these cases. These companies move at the speed of light, but the antitrust cases move at the speed of snails. And, they just don't.
Speed of government.
Yeah, they don't catch up to reality. And then we started to see real slippage. And one thing that a lot of people pointed out to me was this case between Google and Fitbit. Now, it came down at the time of in the transition between the Trump and Biden presidencies, where there wasn't going to be any kind of forceful recommendations or anything happening. The Trump Justice Department was concerned with other matters, let's just say that euphemistically. And so it was really down to Europe to deal with this case. And if you're talking about privacy concerns, you have the number one company that collects data on your body in Fitbit, and you have the number one company that collects data everywhere else in Google. And so putting these two together obviously created privacy concerns and antitrust concerns. But the EU just waved it through. And that was seen as a signal that, yeah, they don't have it. They don't have this understanding of the linkages between, for example, privacy, antitrust, trade, industrial policy, all of these things that have come together in the Biden administration. So it was interesting to be at this conference where a lot of U.S. enforcers, Catherine Tai, the USTR was there. I talked to her for the piece. Lena Khan was she beamed in. Jonathan Cantor was there, the head of the DOJ antitrust. And to see all of these U.S. officials talking almost with one voice about this this kind of revolutionary moment here of this whole of government approach to corporate power, and to see the difference in the EU's continuing go slow, don't make waves approach. It was really striking, and that formed the base of the piece.
You know, it's very interesting because in the period when Vestager had this unearned reputation, the big tech firms were sort of demonizing her. It was partly earned, partly unearned. But here's the United States with all these checks and balances. The good news about the American system is you get a president who's actually a believer, who can appoint someone like Lena Khan or Jonathan Cantor. We can actually make some waves and make a difference. You probably saw Lena Khan was interviewed on Colbert the other night, and she was treated like
Jon Stewart, but yes.
Stewart. Yeah. No, it was Colbert.
No, it was Jon Stewart.
Okay, it was Jon Stewart. Anyway, but the point is, when was the last time Jon Stewart interviewed the head of the FTC? So she's a rock star. And the point is, this stuff is popular with the public. And Biden knows that it's popular with the public. So sometimes in the United States, the stars align in the right direction. I mean, under Reagan with Bork, the stars aligned in the wrong direction and euthanized antitrust for 40 years. And so to some extent, the Lena Khans of the world learned a little bit from what Europe was trying to do, but they went off on their own. And it's great that there was this conference where the American regulators on antitrust competition policy and the Europeans are kind of putting their heads together. It's a case where we're learning from each other in the right direction rather than the wrong direction.
There was a little bit of learning. Two things strike me in what you just said. Number one, we should mention that in that interview with Lena Khan on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, who had previously done a show for Apple, mentioned that he was asked not to interview Lena Khan when he did his Apple show, which shows you the power of these tech giants and how they've moved well beyond just tech platforms, but now are involved in entertainment and autos and all of these other facets, and using their power in those venues. The second thing is that, and this is a big part of my piece, is this sort of mirror image that we see between the U.S. and Europe. So in the U.S., we absolutely can't get legislation done on this particular issue at any rate. There were attempts to do certain regulatory kind of strictures on platforms to prevent things like self-preferencing, where they preference their own products, to prevent what happens in the app stores with these large, 30% fees, gatekeeper fees, basically by Apple and Google for in-app purchases, things like that. All that legislation went under, and this was when Democrats had a trifecta. But as you say, under aggressive regulators, they can use the existing laws and they can use them to great effect. Right now, all the four major tech platforms are in active litigation with the government. So in Europe, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, Lena Khan said in that interview, she has plenty of authority under the Sherman Act of 1890.
Right. 1890, so exactly. Going back,
aggressive reading of the Sherman Act, even though Congress is stymied, the abuses in 1890, with different particulars, were exactly the same sort of abuses.
So that's the U.S. picture. You can't get legislation done, but you can use the existing laws.
Right.
In Europe, it takes some time, but you can get legislation done. You can get regulation done. And in fact, what they're doing in Europe is basically they've said antitrust doesn't work. It's too long. It's too after the fact. It's too ex post. We're going to go with regulation. They've passed something called the Digital Markets Act, which does a lot of the things that the U.S. had in that legislation. They have a thing called the Digital Services Act, which builds on that. The AI Act, which is the very first legislative kind of action from a national body in the world. But they don't have the power within the bureaucracy to actually make that legislation, that regulation, meaningful in any particular way. The way that they had this thing called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. and they outsourced it to all the national bodies, the different nation member states. And what happened was the big tech firms all put their headquarters in the states most likely to be helpful to them, like Ireland and Luxembourg, these low tax havens. And their data protection authorities did nothing because they didn't want to upset that relationship where they were, they had these headquarters. So now with the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, they said, okay, we'll do it at the commission. We won't rely on the national authorities. But the way that they're going about it is that they have each firm that is being regulated offer a sort of compliance list. This is what we're going to do. And the commission does not tell them what they have to do to comply. After they are given this list, then they say, well, let's see if this works and let's see if this doesn't. They have these workshops and they go through this process. It's very passive. It's very kind of allows the companies to take the lead. And it's very unclear. Obviously, if you tell a company, well, you write your own compliance, they're going to do exactly what they can get away with, right? They're going to walk right up to the line. And so we have this kind of mirror image in the US and Europe. We have strong enforcers here and weak legislative actions, and strong legislative actions in Europe and weak enforcers.
So a couple of comments in terms of one, public opinion. Public opinion in the US, in Europe, really doesn't like the platform giants. And so there's kind of a tailwind in terms of the EU and the EC and the bureaucracy having public opinion on their side. And the tech companies have tried to use American trade law to argue that, well, this is nationalism. And the reason they don't like the tech companies is they're American companies and they're being discriminated against these American companies. Lena Khan, to her great credit, just last week in the annual trade report said, we're not going to play that game. The Biden administration is in favor of regulating this stuff. We are not, unlike the past 40 years, we are not going to let trade law supersede national regulation, either by the Europeans or by us or by anybody else. And I want to offer two quotes that are completely unrelated to each other, but are both instructive. Okay. So the first quote, you and I were talking with somebody yesterday, and we said to her, what do you think differentiates the Prospect from other progressive magazines? And she said, well, you're wonkier. And I mean that as a huge compliment. And you look at a story, Dave, like the one that you wrote this week, the stuff is incredibly technical. It's incredibly intimidating for civilians. And to do the kind of explainer, deep digging journalism that you do that kind of makes this accessible to your average citizen, I think is a real service, because this is really complicated stuff. First of all, you got to get your mind around how it works. Then you have to explain it in terms that ordinary citizens understand. And I think the second quote that I stumbled on many years ago. So in 1938, Friedrich Hayek, the libertarian theorist of that era who had so much influence, said the following. This is almost a direct quote. He said, I am in favor of European federation because with European federation, neither the federation nor the individual member states would be able to regulate capitalism. And this might be the one issue on which Hayek was prophetic, because that's exactly what has come to pass with the EU. And the larger story here, of which your story and the stuff that I write, a lot of the other stuff that the Prospect does is a part, is how do you housebreak capitalism? How do you take predatory capitalism, which becomes stronger by the year, and make it a socially bearable, economically decent system?
Well, this is a good segue into what you wrote this week. So we'll go to that. But I just would say to people who are going to the Prospect website, the piece is called Eurocrats on the Brink. I kind of half wish you mentioned that Hayek quote to me before now, and I would have put it in the piece. But I want to go to what you wrote. And these things, by the way, are in the latest edition of the American Prospect magazine, which is being sent out now. But you did our prospects column, which is usually the place for big ideas, and you certainly delivered that in this particular one. Um, uh, the idea is, and I believe it's called "Liberals Should Be Radicals," and you talk about sort of the forces that have created this precarity in the U.S. for most people, for most of the middle class, and how the solutions and the remedies go beyond mere tweaks or mere changes of perspective. And so, talk about what you wrote in that piece.
Well, Dave, this started out with the column that Paul Krugman has probably written 15 times, and that other people have written, that asked the question, why does Biden not get more credit for the fact that the economy has really improved under his watch? So inflation's down, job creation is up, median wages are actually up about 4%. That's about 1.5 points more than inflation. So why is the guy not getting any credit for this? And I guess the one-liner here is that if you look at what's happened to the last two generations compared with my generation, the American dream is just not attainable to younger people. It's not attainable to working class families. And so if you unpack the American dream, what are we talking about? We're talking about home ownership as a way to accumulate wealth. Well, housing costs are just out of sight. Rental costs are worse. The number of Americans, this is in the economic report of the president, they have a chapter on housing, who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, has doubled since the 1960s. So anchor of the American dream, not just a nice place to live, but a way to accumulate wealth over a lifetime, housing, forget it. It's just not attainable to most people. And even if you can afford a house, you're not going to get the kind of windfall that my generation got, where the thing appreciates over time. And when you're ready to retire, you have a very nice nest egg. So then you say, well, okay, what about employment? Again, a generation or two ago, most jobs were payroll jobs. They had good fringe benefits. They weren't gigs. They had the prospect of a career. You could have a working class blue collar job and be middle class on one income, no less. That's certainly gone. And then you look at retirement. A generation ago, 55% of Americans had real retirement plans where technical term is a defined benefit plan, and you retire after X number of years, 30 years, on 80 or 85% of your best years income. That's gone. 11% of people have traditional retirement plans, and 401ks just don't do it. And then the healthcare system is just a colossal nightmare. Obamacare, I'm a critic of Obamacare. I think it reinforces the existing system run by private insurance companies. And yeah, you can get insurance, but if you take the bronze plan, so-called, you're paying a fortune in deductibles and copays. If you take the gold plan, you're paying a fortune in premiums. And so you look
and
at—
I would add what was the gold plan, which was Medicare, which was the sort of the perfect list, of what we want out of a single payer insurance program, is increasingly being privatized by health insurance companies, which are shuttling people into Medicare Advantage plans, which now are over half of all new signups.
And in addition to intensively managing, quote unquote, your policy, making it difficult to get the treatment you need, the choice of doctors, the drugs that you need, they also do something really sneaky where if you want to switch back to conventional public Medicare, you don't get to buy Medigap if you have been on Medicare Advantage.
That's right. In most states, yes.
Yeah.
They basically bring back the pre-existing condition exclusion in those states and say, well, Medigap has the ability to underwrite you if you try to switch back. The other thing they do, of course, is use something called upcoding, which is how they rip off the government. They basically say, okay, when we diagnose a patient, we're going to diagnose them with 16 different maladies so that we're going to get a higher risk adjustment reimbursement from the government because we're treating sicker patients, even though we're not treating any of those maladies. We're just listing them on a code.
So it's all gamesmanship. I mean, we spend 18% of GDP on healthcare. Britain spends about half of that. Britain's a poorer country. Britain has better morbidity and mortality statistics because they have a national health system and they don't waste money on all these middlemen. Okay, so full stop. What's the punchline? The punchline is that the remedies to every one of these problems, if you really
Right.
want to change how people live, are at the far fringe of what has passed for mainstream discourse. Bernie Sanders, maybe, Elizabeth Warren on a good day. So, what do you need? Oh, I didn't mention student debt. That's the other
Right.
absolute travesty. I mean, when I was
Affordable
a kid,
college has become debt. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So, when I was a kid, you could go to college. You could go to a state university system um, with no debt, and state universities were free. So, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the flagship public system in the state where I live, $37,000 a year for in-state students, counting tuition, board, and fees. So you tick off all those all those elements of the vanished American dream. The remedies for every single one of them is radical. And of course, this gets to our next topic, which is tax policy. You really have to tax the bejesus out of corporations and rich people in order to underwrite free higher education, like most European countries still have, debt relief, not just single payer, but decommercialized, decommodified national health insurance, a second tier of Social Security that substitutes for the kind of pension plans that workers used to have, not
Right.
401ks, which are completely inadequate. And all of this is doable, but you need two things. You need a working majority of progressives in Congress and a president with the political will to do it. And I think, Biden has made a pretty good start, but he's certainly directionally better. He's reversed ground on all the neoliberal assumptions. He's introduced infrastructure and supply chain legislation. He's the most pro-union president since Roosevelt. He's tried to do what he can within the limits of executive power and conservative courts on student debt relief and on reducing drug prices. But most of this, because of the right-wing courts, because of his, semi-non-existent majority in Congress, most of these are tweaks. And tweaks are not going to fix this. So, as our friend Stan Greenberg keeps pointing out, Biden ought to be campaigning on what he would do in his next term with a progressive Congress. And those commitments ought to be radical so that they fire people's imagination and so that they are seen as transformative.
Right. So I have a few things that I want to comment on relative to that. So to bring it back to where you were, the reason that people aren't sort of responding to the better economy. I mean, we just got a jobs report today with 300,000 new jobs created. 15 million jobs have been created over the course of the administration, which is a record. And the reason why this isn't resonating to a major degree, although it's improving somewhat. I mean, part of it is inflation, right? People hate inflation. They haven't experienced it in a generation, and they're mad about it. But the other part is that all of these accumulated risk shifts onto the individual have made it so that the ability to get a job isn't quite enough here, and alleviating some of these other burdens that you're talking about is just as important. The second thing I want to bring up is, because I have a piece on this just today, a perfect example of this whole idea of tweaks versus radical policies, and policies that are seen as radical now that weren't that radical 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So we have a pilot shortage in this country. We're going to need thousands and thousands more pilots in order to meet the demand for air travel over the next 20 years. And flight schools are very expensive. They can be as much as $80,000 for 4 years. And so the question is, how are we going to increase the pipeline of pilots when it's very expensive to become a pilot and learn and have the kind of training that you kind of need to go up in the air and fly a plane? Well, the Congress came up with this solution. They put it into the FAA reauthorization bill, and that's to increase the loan limits for flight school. So they're saying, okay, the loan limits were a little low, so now we have you can get enough debt to afford flight school, quote unquote, afford, even though you got to pay back the debt. The Republicans then put in a particular provision into this saying, all these mass cancellation programs that are out there, they are prohibited, they are exempted in the case of flight schools. So what have we done? Like, the policy was, we need more pilots. And so what we did is we said, you can take on more debt if you want to become a pilot. And by the way, you can never get out of it. You can never get out of the debt, even if you want to potentially do income-driven repayment program where you pay only as much as you as a percentage of your income. We're not going to cancel that at the end. We're not going to cancel it if you were defrauded by your flight school. So we're putting all this risk on the individual, and that is part and parcel with the sort of neoliberal policy shift over the last 40 years. That's the second thing I wanted to get into. And then the third thing, which segues us into our next consideration, is the way that you get this done. And you alluded to it, which is through the tax code. Now, next week is tax day, or a week from Monday, I should say. And we are in the middle of an election campaign that seems like nobody knows about it, but the major fiscal policy that's going to be determined by this election is on tax policy, because the Trump tax cuts, which are worth trillions and trillions of dollars, the individual versions of those all expire. The corporate tax cuts are permanent, but the individual tax cuts that were in the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, all expire at the end of 2025. And this election and who wins will determine the path that we go in with those tax cuts the next time around. So we're talking about, on the Trump side, not only do they want to make all of those tax cuts permanent, but Trump is playing footsie around lowering the corporate rate even more. He's talking about reducing certain individual tax rates. And Biden has talked about a billionaire's tax minimum, where if you're Jeff Bezos, you're going to pay more than a nurse or a firefighter. He's talking about restoring some of the things that were cut in those individual tax cuts. And if you add it all up, it's $5 trillion in taxes. Now, what he's going to use that for, it kind of remains to be seen. It's going to be some of this stuff that we're talking about, but I don't know how far it's going to go. It's going to probably be some childcare stuff, some paid leave stuff, and a lot of it, maybe too much of it, will be put towards deficit reduction. But these are stakes of the election that I think nobody knows about. Like, it's very weird that we're only talking about $5 trillion, and those are the stakes of the election. And either side isn't really talking about it. The Republicans, because it's not popular, what they want to do, which is give tax breaks to the wealthy. The Democrats, because they're much more focused on democracy, abortion, and to a smaller degree, lowering costs, because they want to fight the inflation angle. But this idea of not just raising taxes on the rich, but using that money to fund these kinds of things that you were talking about, that's been a bit absent.
Well, and the fact that a nickel of this is going to deficit reduction is crazy. Again, Biden is better on this than Clinton or Obama, both of whom made deficit reduction kind of the fiscal centerpiece. Crazy on both counts, even crazier in Obama's case, where he started focusing on deficit reduction in 2009, before we were even beginning to be out of the Great Recession. And this dates back to Walter Mondale in 1984, where Mondale, and the speech was written by Robert Rubin, and Mondale says, if you elect me, I'm going to raise your taxes. And by the way, I'm going to raise your taxes so that we can balance the budget. Well, you can see how well that worked out. He carried one state. And yet the Democrats have this, we're the grown-ups in the room, and the Republicans may not care about fiscal balance, but we do. Well, you know what? This time, let's care more about what we can do to help regular people and to transform some of this vanished American dream, because they should be talking about it, because it's potentially very popular. And you've got some little stuff. You've got Biden wants to give a $400 a month subsidy through the tax code to first-time home buyers. Well, that just about equals the interest rate increase courtesy of the Fed. I mean, if you went back where interest rates had been, that's about $300 or $400 a month. So he's, this is why the prospect exists, among other things, is to give our friends a push and to make them better at what they do.
I mean, the thing is, I think Democrats are still stung sort of by the Mondale example. So Walter Mondale in 1984 gives a speech at the DNC and says, I'll raise your taxes, and so will Reagan, and he won't tell you about it, and I just did. And then he got 10 electoral votes, like 13 electoral votes.
But I mean, they should be stung by Mondale as an example of what not to do.
But here's the thing: the worm has turned on this. The polling is very clear that people want to have corporations and the wealthy pay their fair share. Biden's adhering to this pledge that nobody under $400,000 is going to see a tax increase. And there's a reason for that, because it's probably pretty popular to say that. But there's so much at the top end that is available. And none of this was used for his industrial policies and his legislative policies in the first term. I mean, only the corporate minimum tax, that was really the only tax related thing. The rest of the funding for the IRA, for example, was tax enforcement. In other words, collecting what is already owed, and prescription drug reform. And so there's still this $5 trillion that's available, where you don't have to worry about paying for anything in terms of the pay-go laws and things like that, because it's all there in this tax example, and it's all there concentrated at the very top. You can literally get $5 trillion from the very people making above $400,000 a year.
Well, you have a very nice example in your state of California, where you've got a surtax on very rich people that's incredibly popular, that brought in, I think, $200 million a year last time I looked. This is the tax on mega mansions.
Yeah. Well, there's the tax on mega mansions. There's also a millionaire tax that was put in 2010. That has done a lot of good in terms of funding education. So people, I don't think you need to look at this through the lens of 40 years ago. It's not an accident that Trump isn't really talking about his tax plans, because they're not popular. And he, has this kind of lizard brain where he knows what's popular and what's not. They're not popular, and that's what but it's also the main thing that he did when he was in office the first time, and the main thing he's going to do when he's in office the second time, which is that the corporate interests will get to him, and they will force him to not only make permanent what was temporary in the law, which is a $5 trillion consideration, but even go further than that.
Dave, you're raising another point, which I think is very much a part of this larger conversation, if I may segue to one of my other pieces, working people need to be educated on the fact that Trump is not on their side economically. And no
Right.
matter how much Trump may be the avenging angel for their general sense of frustration, if you take a closer look at whose interests he's serving, it's corporations, it's mega millionaires, it's all the forces in society that are screwing regular working people. So I had a piece the other day. I kind of stumbled on this in the course of taking a deeper look at the Francis Scott Key Bridge. I wondered
Hmm.
why it was that this is another one of these earthquake warnings.
Oh no.
Jesus Christ.
We got another one going? I don't see
I don't
the
know.
screen shaking, so
Okay, good.
probably not.
Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Your piece was about whether or not the workers, tragically, the 6 workers who were filling potholes on the bridge, who when it collapsed and several of them died, whether they were being misclassified as independent contractors and whether they were being underpaid relative to the Davis-Bacon Act prevailing wage laws.
yeah, and in the course of doing some digging on that, I found I had known this that in 2014, after several years of spade work by the Labor Department under Obama, Obama issues a comprehensive all-of-government executive order called Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces.
Right.
And that was an all-of-government order creating a master database to keep track of which companies were chronic violators of major labor laws, wage and hour,
Right.
Davis-Bacon, Wagner Act, OSHA. And in 2016, the Associated Building Contractors found a judge in Texas to hold this unconstitutional. And then before they can decide whether to appeal it, Trump gets elected. Trump repeals the order. And then for good measure, Congress acts under the CRA to make sure that nobody ever reinstates the same order. So it's a classic example of how Republican legislators, Republican courts just screw the attempts by government to protect working people. And there are lots and lots of examples of this. There was just another case last week where a Biden order on project labor agreements, which is kind of essential to carry out the intent of these infrastructure bills,
Yeah.
that they produce good union jobs. They found a judge in Florida to issue an injunction against that. So
Yeah.
we need a lot more education on the fact that, yeah, he may help you experience some psychic gratification, but in terms of
Right.
your actual pocketbook situation, he is screwing you time after time after time. And maybe with enough publicity, enough education, the Democrats can peel off a few percentage of those folks.
Well, I mean, we're obviously a small piece of the picture here, but it's certainly my intention over the next several months at the prospect to, when we are talking about the presidential election, to really key in on those stakes, the stakes for regular people, and what the policies that have been articulated, whether by Trump directly or in that Project 2025 document, which is clearly going to be the roadmap to what they're going to do, what they actually mean for regular people. And this is a unique case because often in presidential elections, you really only have the platforms to go on because these are people who have not been in office before. You can look at their record in the states or as a senator or whatever. But it's usually only the incumbent who is judged on their record in office, right? In this case, we have two a former president and the current president. We don't have to guess what Donald Trump is going to do when he's in office. We already saw it. We have the records. We have the records in this case of him repealing the Fair, Safe Workplaces and Fair Pay Act. We already have it. We know what he's going to do on high road contracting. He's going to get rid of it. He's probably not going to do a whole lot of Buy American stuff. He's probably not going to do a whole lot of stuff that the Trade Department is doing. U.S. Trade Representative in terms of changing the paradigm on global trade. We don't have to wonder and get into the sort of semantics of looking at the white paper and turning it upside down and trying to figure out exactly what's going to be done. We know it. We have it. We have it right there. And so that's going to be a really unique facet of this election that I think is potentially useful to campaigns and to media. Whether it actually will be useful or whether the media will, run the same stories that they always run remains to be seen.
Well, and too much of the media is covering this as a horse race, and too much of the media is covering this as if it were just another election, just another horse race, rather than a kind of momentous election determining whether the country goes neo-fascist. So I think, the conventional wisdom is you're never going to peel off people who are part of the MAGA base. And that's basically true, but you do sort of have soft Trump voters who are a little scared by how crazy he's become. And if you can appeal to those folks on the basis of their pocketbook interests, that there are palpable differences between what the Democrats would do, what Trump would do as a second term, that helps. Abortion rights helps. Putting away Israel-Palestine would help. I mean, every little bit helps. And I think
that would help quite a lot.
Yeah, but I think our particular strength is to do deep dives into these political economy issues. And as the Romans used to say, cui bono, I mean, who benefits? And to explain in simple English, who would benefit if Trump gets elected? Who would benefit if Biden gets elected?
100%. And one way to look at that's sort of a real world example that's happening right now. We broke the story this morning that the UAW announced that there's going to be an election, a union election in Alabama, Vance, Alabama, for a Mercedes plant that has over 5,000 workers, where the UAW has obtained a super majority of union cards, people pledging to vote for the union. This is despite captive audience meetings that are going on right now, people all the way up to the CEO of Mercedes-Benz U.S. International, downplaying the union, saying that this would ruin our big happy family. Part of the reason that the UAW feels compelled to spend $40 million on organizing is not just, part of it is the turnover and bringing in Sean Fain, of course, who is just a much more aggressive union leader than we've seen in this country in a long time. But part of it is because of this particular moment that the Biden administration's NLRB has been much more favorable to union organizing, that there's obviously, in the wake of the big three contracts, which were a big success for the UAW, there's this window of opportunity over the next year before the election to get, and where they're doing it is also very interesting because it's largely these non-union plants that migrated to the South. That's where a lot of auto production moved towards, away from the Midwest, away from the union strongholds, to put in place basically a large non-union auto sector in this country. And so I think it's not only important because it would restore the UAW to a certain amount of strength and boost their efforts both in these non-union facilities and also in their big three facilities, because they would be able to work at par. But it's also important for the South in general, just to see a large factory going union in that part of the country can inspire more activity there as well. So what do you think, historically, having seen these union efforts over the last 40 years, what do you think about that?
Well, two comments on this particular one. I mean, it's symbolically perfect that this is a Mercedes-Benz plan, because when Henry Ford, I think it was 1909, raised wages to $5 a day, he said he did it so that the workers could afford to buy the cars, no worker in that plant, even with the best contract in the world, is going to be able to buy a Benz.
Right.
And
Right. That's true.
the other, and they know it. They know it.
Right.
And the other
But they
point is,
also know how much the company is making off of their toil and their labor.
right.
This we did some reporting on this. In 17 years, the cumulative raises that line workers got at Mercedes was $4.50 an hour. So
But
that's
here,
over 17 years.
but here's the other really important thing. That's a right to work state. And if you can get a supermajority of people signing cards in a right to work state, that means that you are relying on worker consciousness and worker militants rather than a technical provision of the Wagner Act. And that's so much more. It's the only way we're going to organize in right to work states is if workers have the consciousness and the solidarity to realize that, well, okay, even though I can free ride on my brothers and sisters here and work here and get the benefits of the union contract and not pay union dues, I'm not going to do it because I understand solidarity. And that's how we're going to make inroads in right to work states.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And I think the way that UAW is going about this, both in Alabama and also in Tennessee, that's where the first election is going to be, the
Yeah.
Volkswagen plant out there, which is just in a couple of weeks. I mean, one of the things that the Biden NLRB did is change the rules so that these elections aren't so drawn out. The union election in Volkswagen is going to be April 17th to the 19th, just in a couple of weeks from now, after they only announced that they were filing for an election a couple of weeks ago. So that kind of quick strike keeps the management off guard and enables this organizing campaign to take root. But I think the way that they're going about it is really looking at it as a community process. So getting the community on board with this kind of thing. Obviously, the management figured that out a long time ago. They have politicians in Tennessee and Alabama already preemptively attacking the union, sort of implicitly threatening subsidies that the facility has gotten over the years if they go union. Now, of course, there's now all these federal subsidies for clean energy, so it rings very hollow that they're going to take away their Hamilton County, Tennessee tax benefit when they're getting oodles of money at the federal level. But the point is that management had figured out that they can use the community to their advantage, that they can use the sensibility in the South, that they can use elected officials saying, don't do this. And now we're seeing this grassroots effort happen on the union side as well, which I think is in part unique for the modern day, but also sort of back to the past of how these elections were waged, in the formative stages.
Yeah, in the old days when you had a stronger labor movement, I mean, unions and union halls and union families were sort of central to the civic fabric of these small and medium-sized towns, and that gave them a lot of their power until the jobs were all outsourced.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Well, we have a few more minutes left. Maybe we'll take people in behind the scenes here on what you're thinking about in future writings over the next week or two.
Well, so I'm working on a couple of big pieces. One piece on the health system and how the health system has this crazy individualized pricing. I mean, it's like an airline, right? Every patient has a different price tag, depending on what kind of insurance you have and depending on what kind of games the hospital and the health system play.
Right.
And that's one of the things that both rips off patients and makes the whole system more efficient. And you have so many more people in the health system paying attention to gaming the system and getting paid for them than for treating patients. So it's
like a rough version of first order price discrimination, right? Because if you're a health company, by virtue of whether or not the patient has insurance, and also by virtue of what insurance the patient has, that's a rough guide to their ability to pay. If they have gold-plated insurance, you kind of know that they're probably pretty well off. And so you can exploit that by saying, okay, this insurance, we're going to charge a higher amount for the same surgery as another insurance. And the way that they get away with this, because people would be pissed off if they said, wait a second, I got a hip replacement and you got a hip replacement and I paid $5,000 more. The reality is that you don't pay that. Your insurance company pays that, and you do a copay, and you might pay more because of that copay, but you attribute that to the insurance company. You don't attribute that to the hospital. And so there's this hidden aspect of it that you know the government has tried to increase price transparency around hospitals, and hospitals have just not done it, right? They've just not complied with this law.
I don't know if you remember Mad Magazine, Spy versus Spy. I mean, everything the government does invites a more Baroque form of gamesmanship. Let me see if I can tell the story in 30 seconds. So if you are admitted, you are reimbursed under Medicare Part A. If you were admitted for observation, the hospital is paid under Medicare Part B, which means there's a 20% copay that comes out of the patient's pocket. I could give you 100 examples like that. And the government, it's whack-a-mole. I mean, the government just can't keep up with it because the highest paid people in the whole health system are the people who are paid to figure out how to game the system. So that's one story that I'm writing. And I'm also, you know, the latest Biden versus Bibi, I mean, it's too little, it's too late. Bibi's playing Biden like a violin. I'm not sure anything has fundamentally changed. I'm going to see how that plays out over the next couple of days. I'm going to be writing something about that. I'm going to be writing something about the allure of exile. The piece is called The Political Economy of Exile. And a lot of people think, hey, if Trump gets elected, I'm leaving the country. Well, guess what? That's for sale. And $250,000 and up, you can find a country to take you in. If you're just an ordinary emigre, oh, sorry, you know, 1938 Germany, you're out of luck. So a lot of
That's interesting. Give me a little more on that. So you're telling me that countries have put essential taxes on U.S. immigration?
No, it's if you want a visa that allows you to apply for permanent legal residence, you have to invest. It goes from 250,000 if you want to go to Malta, or 350,000 if you want to go to Hungary.
But what do you mean by invest? Do you mean like you have to invest in property there, or
you have to invest? You have to invest in the local economy. The Brits, £2 million. The Canadians, $1.5 million Canadian dollars. So everything's for sale, you know. And I think this is only going to be good until tens of millions of Americans try to emigrate, and then they're going to make it harder because who wants tens of millions of Americans?
Right. Exactly. Really interesting. Well, you know, I should show my work here as well a little bit. We're going to be writing about some developments with respect to the Justice Department leadership, which has been criticized for, you know, I mean, there's an interesting dichotomy. We started this conversation talking about the new aggressiveness within corporate power and antitrust. And that's one division of the Justice Department. But if you look overall at the Justice Department and their statistics on prosecuting corporate crime, they're pretty weak. And Public Citizen has done good work on this. The transactional records clearinghouse at Syracuse University has done good work on this. They're at the Trumpian, if not below the Trumpian level in terms of prosecuting corporate crime. And a lot of that goes back to the leadership at main justice, not in the various divisions, but people like Lisa Monaco, who's the number two at justice, and Merrick Garland. You know, obviously the buck stops with the Attorney General. So I'm going to be writing a little bit about that. There's some progressive groups who are finally starting to agitate on that. And then the other thing we already talked about, which is taxes in 2024. I just think it's a major issue that we're going to keep on top of. So great. Bob, this was a great discussion. Thank you for being here. As always, we will archive this and put it up at prospect.org. You'll be able to see that later today. And I thank you for being with us, and have a good rest of your day.